Hello, everybody. We continue with our daily Bible reading. We're up to 2 Chronicles, chapter 21. After 20, what an amazing chapter 20 was. Probably one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible. It was just wonderful. So we're up to 21 now, and now there's a new king, Jeroboam, or Jeroram, who ruled after Josaphat in Judah. And we read, let's open up in prayer first before we read here. We got the Shema found in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, Baruch Shem Kivo, Malchuto, Leolam Vaed. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our Elohim, Yahweh is one. And you shall love Yahweh with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And have these words which I command you this day be upon your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your children, and speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you retire and when you rise. And you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and let them be frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorpost of your house, and upon your gates. All righty, so we're in chapter 21, and we read here in 21, verse 1. When Josaphat died, he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. Then his son, Jeroram, became the next king. Jeroram's brothers, the other sons of Josaphat, were Azariah, Jael, Zechariah, Azariah, Michael, and Stephanitis. All these were the sons of Josaphat, the king of Judah. Their father had given each of them valuable gifts of silver and costly items, and also some of Judah's fortified towns. However, he designated Jeroram as the next king because he was the oldest. But when Jeroram had become solidly established as king, he killed all his brothers and some of the other leaders of Judah. Wow. That's just terrible. That's just terrible. So he killed his brothers and some of the other leaders of Judah. And it says here in verse 5, Jeroboam was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. But Jeroboam followed the example of the kings of Israel, and was wicked as King Ahab, for he had married one of Ahab's daughters. So Jeroboam did what was evil in Yahweh's sight. The note here says Jeroboam, the new king, married Athaliah, one of the daughters of King Ahab of Israel. She became the mother of Judah's next king, Azariah. Adela's mother was Jezebel, the most wicked woman Israel had ever known. Jeroboam's marriage to Athaliah was Judah's downfall, for Athaliah brought her mother's wicked influence into Judah, causing the nation to forget Yahweh and turn to Baal worship. And verse 7 says, but Yahweh did not want to destroy David's dynasty, for he had made a covenant with David and promised that his descendants would continue to rule, shining like a lamp forever. So our note for verse 7 says, Yahweh promised that a descendant of David would always sit on the throne. 2 Samuel 7:8-16. What happened to this promise when the nation was destroyed and carried away? There were two parts to Yahweh's promise. In the physical sense, as long as there was an actual throne in Judah, a descendant of David would sit upon it. But this part of the promise depended on the obedience of the kings. When they disobeyed, Yahweh was not bound to continue David's temporal line. And number two, in the spiritual sense, this promise was completely filled in the coming of Yeshua our Messiah, a descendant of David who would sit in the throne of David forever. And now we see verse 8 that says, during Judah's reign, the Edomites revolted against Judah and crowned their own king. So Jeroram went out with his full army and all his chariots. The Edomites surrounded him and his chariot commanders, but he went out at night and attacked them under the cover of darkness. Even so, Edom had been independent from Judah to this day. So the town of Libnah also revolted the same time. All this happened because Jeroboam had abandoned Yahweh, the Elohim of his ancestors. Now, the note here from verses 8 to 11 says, Jeroboam's reign was marked by sin and cruelty. He married a woman who worshipped idols. He killed his 6 brothers. He allowed even promoted idol worship. Yet he was not killed in battle or by treachery. He died by a lingering and painful disease. Punishment for sin is not always immediate or dramatic, but if we ignore Yahweh's laws, we will eventually suffer the consequences of our sin. And it says here in verse 11, he had built pagan shrines in the hill country of Judah and had led people of Jerusalem and Judah to give themselves to pagan gods and go astray. Then Elijah the prophet wrote this letter. And we see in verse 12, Elijah the prophet wrote this letter. This is what Yahweh, the Elohim of your ancestor David says. You have not followed the good example of your father Jehoshaphat or your grandfather King Asa in Judah. Instead, you have been as evil as the kings of Israel. You have led the people of Jerusalem and Judah into worship of idols, just as King Ahab did in Israel. And you have even killed your own brothers, men who were better than you. And that was for verse 12 and 13. And the letter continues. So now Yahweh is about to strike you, your people, your children, your wives, and all that is yours with a heavy blow. You yourself will suffer with severe intestinal disease that will get worse each day until your bowels come out. Wow. And the note here says this was Elijah, was after Elijah had been translated and proved that he was not in heaven, but still on earth. So that's a very interesting note here in the Hebraic root scriptures. Again, I'll read it for verse 12, as it said, then Elijah the prophet wrote this letter. And it says, this was after Elijah had been translated and proves he was not in heaven, but still on earth. And then, so his consequence was this disease. And I often say disease is a result of sin, right? So verse 16 says, Then Yahweh stirred up the Philistines and the Arabs who lived near the Ethiopians to attack Jeroboam. They marched against Judah, broke down its defenses, and carried away everything of value in the royal palace, including the king's sons and his wives. His youngest son, Azariah, was spared. Verse 18, after all this, Yahweh struck Jeroboam with an incurable intestinal disease. The disease grew worse and worse. In the end, after 2 years, it caused his bowels to come out, and he died in agony. His people did not build a great funeral fire to honor him, as they done for his ancestors. Now, in verse 19, it says the burning of spices. They did not build this in the One New Man Bible. And then we read another note for verse 12. It says, Chronicles mentions Elijah only here. Much more about the great prophet can be found in 1 Kings 17:1-2, or 17:1, and 2 Kings 2:11. All right. So now we're up to verse 20. It says, Jeroboam was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. No one was sorry when he died. They buried him in the city of David, but not in the royal cemetery. And then the one that was spared by the Arabs and Ethiopians, Azariah ruled in Judah. After that, we'll see that in chapter 22. But that is our Bible reading for today. And we see how quickly everything declined in Israel or in Judah, from the righteous king of Jehoshaphat to his son who was unrighteous and created all these wicked sins. Well, it wasn't as exciting as the last chapter, but still the history to learn is so important, and the consequence for our sin. So that was the Bible reading for today, everybody. Have a blessed day. Yahweh be with you all, and shalom, shalom.